The next presenter will be Elias Muhanna, who is Manning Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at Brown University. He is the author of a monograph, The World in a Book, Al-Nuwairi and the Islamic Encyclopedic Tradition, which came out with Princeton University Press last year. Also a translation, The Ultimate Ambition in the Arts of Erudition, a compendium of universal knowledge from the classical Islamic world, which is a translation of Al-Nuwairi as well, which was, I think, somewhat surprisingly to me, though not after I read the book, one of NPR's best books of the year in 2016 and one of The Guardian's best books of the year. It was on bestseller lists. It was reviewed widely in newspapers. This doesn't happen very often with translations of medieval Arabic books, but when you read Elias's translation, then you'll understand why. It's a really wonderful translation of an amazing source. He's also edited a collection, The Digital Humanities and Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, which came out with De Gruyter in 2016. He's written a number of articles on wide-ranging topics relating to Mamluk history and manuscript culture, including the Sultan's new clothes, Ottoman Mamluk gift exchange in the 15th century, which came out of a seminar we took together in graduate school, and which was published by Mukarnas in 2010 and won the Margaret Savchenko Prize of the Historians of Islamic Art Association. He's also written a wide range of pieces for public consumption in outlets including The New York Times, The New Yorker, and The Nation. He's won a bunch of prizes, including ACLS fellowships, a Fulbright Scholarship, the Bruce G. Craig Dissertation Prize from Mamluk Studies Review. And today he'll be talking about Antiquarianism and Encyclopedism in the 14th century. Please join me in welcoming Elias.
Okay. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Peter, for organizing this wonderful event. I'm just going to jump right in. The Egyptian and Syrian territories of the Mamluk Empire witnessed the production of encyclopedic texts on a scale unprecedented in Islamic history, works which spanned many volumes and contained material on diverse subjects from history and geography to astronomy and zoology. These texts included a staggering quantity of literary anthologies, cosmographical compendia, lexicons, biographical dictionaries, and miscellanies of various kinds. The literary production of the Mamluk period has long been characterized by scholars as having an antiquarian character. Robert Irwin writes, quote, "Like all true renaissances, it had a backward-looking flavor, and it harked back to the manners and literary productions of 8th and 9th century Abbasid Iraq. The poets of Cairo and Damascus studied the old Baghdadi prescriptions on how to court beautiful slave girls, cultivate male friendships, dress elegantly, and perfume themselves. There was then an antiquarian feel to much of Mamluk belles-lettres and poetry, as its authors looked back on the cult of the Nadim, the cup companion, and the Dharif, the dandy." End of quote. While some have dismissed this preoccupation with classical models as typical of a derivative Alexandrian age, Everett Rowson has shown how literary influence was less a source of anxiety as one of delight. Quote, "For Mamluk writers," he writes, "intertextuality was what literature is all about, and the more of a past one has to deal with, the more one can glory in reproducing, ringing changes on, and playing with that past, to the ongoing enrichment of the Arabic literary tradition." End of quote. This sensitivity toward the antiquarian character of Mamluk literature struck a chord with me as I began work several years ago on the 14th century encyclopedic text of Shihabuddin al-Nuwairi, Nihayat al-Arab fi Funun al-Adab, or what I've translated as The Ultimate Ambition in the Arts of Erudition. Like many other pre-modern encyclopedias, such as Pliny the Elder's Natural History and Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, The Ultimate Ambition is a storehouse of cultural knowledge, a kind of textual museum. A reader perusing its pages might happen upon the recipe for a breath-freshening tonic, or some advice on how to escape from an angry rhinoceros, or a chapter devoted to the medicinal properties of spikenard, porcupine flesh, or marigold blossoms. Replete with Borgesian hierarchies and classificatory schemes, the work presents a window on the social, intellectual, political, and economic landscapes of a pre-modern Islamic society. Or, if not quite a window, perhaps a looking glass. An-Nuwaidi assembled his book from a large library of sources, drawing on materials that originated in different literary traditions, historical epochs from ancient Greece, Persia, to the great archive of classical Arabic Islamic thought. When I first began working on this text, the world that appeared in its pages seemed to me to be not merely a plain reflection of An-Nuwaidi's quotidian reality, but rather a medieval imaginary of warped dimensions, a dream world inhabited by real and fantastical creatures, living and long-dead monarchs, the sights and sounds of 14th century Cairo along scenes from once glorious Baghdad during its golden age. In some recent publications, I explore the conditions underlying An-Nuwaidi's production of this text and its reception, his working methods, and other topics, which you can consult if you like here in these works. This morning, however, I'd like to focus on one specific element of Mamluk encyclopedism, namely the epistemological attitude toward the past. I would like to suggest that these authors experience ruins, objects, and other antiquities through a layer of mediation that was decisive in shaping their perception. That is, the literary and mythological engagements with those antiquities. They are just as aware of those engagements as they are with the antiquities themselves. The authors I will be considering are Shihabuddin An-Nuwaidi and Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, two contemporaries who were high-ranking bureaucrats in the imperial administration of the Mamluk Sultanate and who both produced enormous encyclopedic texts. Their experience in administration proved instrumental to their encyclopedic projects, a subject I explore in depth in my recent monograph and which I will touch on briefly today. So let's begin with An-Nuwaidi's ultimate ambition. This is a text up on the top shelf over to your right. 33 volumes. It is organized into 5 funun, parts, or books, you could say. One on heaven and earth, the human being, animals, plants, history. Each book is organized into 5 sections, which you can see there. And then each section has a number of chapters. If we drill down into section 4.2, so trees and fruit, we will find 3 chapters. On trees whose fruit has an inedible peel, on trees whose fruit has an inedible stone, on trees whose fruit has neither peel nor stone. In the first chapter, we have nuts, pine nuts, as well as things like bananas and bitter oranges, so things with an inedible kind of rind. The next one has your stone fruits, cherries and peaches and plums. And the final one is fruit, so grapes, figs, mulberries, apples, and so on. If we drill down even further into the chapter on figs, is to take a sample, here's the kind of material you might find on the fig. It's a report from a source that came up yesterday in Marina's talk, Ibn Wahshiyya, the author of a work of, it's called the Nabataean Agriculture, which is a kind of magical agronomical text with all sorts of recipes for how to grow different plants without their seeds, using magical methods. He writes, Ibn Wahshiyya said on the generation of the fig, if you mix equal parts fresh mandrake root and branch with honey and wax, and plant this in the ground the way you would plant anything, and pour enough water over it at the time of the planting such that you know that the water will reach the root, and then leave it alone without adding any more water, then a yellow fig will grow from it with intensely sweet figs. And if you mix into the mandrake 4 cloves of garlic and an onion, and pounded the whole mixture together and then planted it, you will have figs whose color is between an intense black and red. Now, An-Nuwaidi was not a city boy. He'd grown up in the countryside. He knew how figs grew. He had a pretty good sense of that, and yet he chose to transmit this very peculiar anecdote. Which, by the way, every it's not just the chapter on the fig that has this. Every chapter has something from Ibn Wahshiyya, as well as stuff from Avicenna, and most importantly, poetry. Every chapter has, at least with the plants and animals, a sample or a few samples of poems that reference the species in question. So they're usually taken from longer poems, descriptions that relate to the topic at hand. He has a poem by Ibn Khafaja, the Andalusian poet, Dark, the color of mountains, they laugh, this is about the fig, they laugh at the frowning gloom. Then, as the forenoon light breaks, they are freckles in the morning's face. It is as though I were gathering in the morning the small breasts of Abyssinian girls. Sort of an arresting image to us today, but an image that would become, after this poem, utterly conventional in the Arabic poetic tradition. After Ibn Khafaj's poem, it becomes impossible to put a fig in a poem without likening it to the breasts of Abyssinian girls, in the way that it becomes difficult to put a banana into a poem without likening it to an elephant tusk dipped in gold, and all these other kinds of conventions that come through in the encyclopedia. So for Nuwaidi, it seemed the antiquarian nature of his appreciation is very clear. By choosing to privilege these sorts of materials rather than more practical materials rooted in everyday life, he seemed to be according the past's view a greater validity than that of the present. It's precisely this sort of collecting and recycling of old materials that gives Mamluk literature its antiquarian label, which is often used in a pejorative sense. Let's take another example. If we go back to the table of contents and go into the chapter on animals, the fifth section, or the book on animals, section 5 on birds, fish, insects, and hunting implements, we get a bunch of chapters. And then in the final chapter on fish, we find the hippopotamus, which is grouped with the sort of aquatic animals. And he says, it has a very large body and the shape of a horse, except that its face is wider and has cloven hoofs like a cow. Its tail is like a pig's and its voice sounds like a horse's. The hippopotamus is only found in the Nile. The hippopotamus comes out of the water onto the land and grazes on crops. When it does so, it does not begin eating from the edge closest to the river, but rather crosses a section containing the amount of food that it wants to eat, turns around, begins eating there so that its face remains pointed towards the river. In other words, it eats its way back to the river. The hippopotamus kills the crocodile and dominates it. When Egyptians see the tracks of its hooves on land, they interpret this as a good omen, that the Nile will overflow and the land will be fertile. Then he says, in the year 1303, a hippo came out onto the land in Giza and ranged far from the rivers, and so it was trapped and killed. Okay, so far so good. So this is a description. It's kind of an odd description. If you've ever seen a hippopotamus, there are certain things that don't seem to work, right? But there it is, right? So it's in the section on animals. In the final book on history, in the final section of that, Islamic history, in the final chapter of that, which is the largest chapter in the book, on Islamic history, or the history of Egypt, rather, of history of Islamic Egypt, we get another description of the hippopotamus. But this is one that is in the context of a historical section, of a chronicle. And it reads like this. In this year, speaking of the year 1303, a strange beast appeared in the Nile. It is a strange beast appeared in the Nile, right? So an unusual beast. It is an animal known as the hippopotamus, and it comes onto the land to eat clover and then returns to the river. On Thursday, the 4th of Jumada 702, January 24, 1303, it was hunted in the delta area of Al-Manufiyya. Its qualities are the following. The color of the hippopotamus is similar to the water buffalo. It is hairless and has ears like a camel. Its vagina is like that of the she-camel, which it covers with a tail that is about a handspan and a half in length, and it looks like a fish's tail. Its neck is as thick as a large stuffed sack, and its mouth as wide as a bow for carding cotton. It has 4 tusks, each of which is less than a handspan in length and is 2 fingers wide. Inside its mouth there are 28 molars, incisors, and other teeth in the shape of carved chess pawns. The height of its belly from the ground is about a cubit. He goes on for another paragraph where he says there are 3 stomachs were found in its gut when they cut it open. When it was hunted, it was too heavy for its hide to be carried by just one camel. They had to sort of trade it off from camel to camel. Let's see. Okay. When the hide was brought before the Sultan, when the animal was hunted, it was skinned, and its hide was brought to me. when I was with the Sultan in the citadel of the mountain. So Nuwaidi was a very high-ranking bureaucrat. He worked in the financial bureau of the empire, and he was a favorite of Sultan Nasir Muhammad in his company all the time. It's brought to meat. When the hide was brought before the Sultan, it was stuffed with straw and placed on its feet. Okay. These two accounts of the hippopotamus in two different places within the ultimate ambition, though apparently similar, in fact describe different animals. The historical account, this one, depicts a real hippopotamus whose physiological dimensions and qualities are summarized on the basis of personal witness. The real hippopotamus has a three-chambered stomach, a four-toed hoof, a tail that resembles that of a fish, wrinkled skin, and about 36 teeth. This mimetic description of the real hippopotamus, which Nuwaidi witnessed himself alongside Sultan Nasir Muhammad, is of a piece with the style of exposition that one encounters in the historical portion of The Ultimate Ambition. He was a careful observer and chronicler of his contemporary surroundings in that section, in the very long historical section. His accounts of political events, administrative appointments, obituaries, and other miscellaneous happenings have long been valued for their historiographical content. The first animal is a different creature altogether, what we might call a literary hippopotamus, or a paper hippopotamus, composed of features drawn from zoological lore. Its reputation for dominating the crocodile and eating its way toward the river appeared in Al-Jahiz's Book of Animals. As per Aristotle, the literary hippopotamus has the cloven hooves of a cow, the tail of a pig, and the neigh of a horse. Unlike the real hippopotamus, which to Nuwaidi's knowledge had not been cited in Egypt in recent memory, the literary hippopotamus was a denizen of the Nile, whose appearance was regarded by Egyptians as a good omen. Why offer two different descriptions of the hippopotamus in the same work? Or to frame the question more generally, why transmit one anecdote so clearly at odds with another anecdote on the same subject? One way to read Nuwaidi's interest in the literary hippopotamus is to assume that he was burdened by the weight of tradition and could not help but to transmit this material. An alternative reading might be to suggest that the older reports still held the sort of cultural cachet that an aspiring literateur was keen to exhibit. They were emblematic of the sort of antiquarian sentimentality that Irwin and Professor Rowson have pointed to. I would like to propose a further reading. Bearing in mind the structure of the ultimate ambition, it may be argued that the category of antiquarian adab represented for Nuwaidi not just a query of quotable materials, but a source of paradigmatic knowledge about the world, the truth of which could not always be measured in terms of its correspondence value to reality. Historiography, on the other hand, was not only a different literary genre, but also a different knowledge practice, an alternative way to address oneself toward the world. One way to think about the differences between these two discourses is to look to the history of Islamic geography and mapmaking. Karen Pinto has argued in a recent work that the thousands of cartographic images that proliferated in the Islamic world beginning in the 13th century, quote, did not strive for mimesis, imitation of the real world. They did not show irregular coastlines, even though some of the geographers whose work includes these maps openly acknowledge that the land masses and their coastlines are uneven. They present instead a deliberately schematic layout of the world and the regions under Islamic control, end of quote. This distinction between the mimetic and schematic modes helps make sense of the two depictions of the hippopotamus in The Ultimate Ambition, and more broadly of the differences between antiquarian edeb and mimetic history that become evident through the attempt to combine them within a single totalizing compendium. And Nuwaidi evidently did not see his role as an arbiter of contradiction between the claims of his authorities and those drawn from his personal experience. This is not because he could not conceive of contradiction per se, but because he held the contradiction between two independent domains of knowledge, such as zoological lore and historiography, was not justification enough to consign one set of these reports to oblivion. It certainly should not be assumed that all encyclopedists shared Nuwaidi's methods. In fact, his approach can be distinguished from that of Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, whose 27-volume historical geographical summa, The Roots of Insight into the Civilized Realms, which is up on the top shelf, displays a very different attitude. It's organized into 27 volumes, which you see here. Geography is at the top, and then we have mainly kind of human geography notable figures in various professions, which makes up about 2/3 of the work, and then we get some natural history, and then a sort of chronological history, analytic history rather. Ibn Fadlallah writes in his preface, having consulted all of the books written about the states and contents of the terrestrial climes, I did not find any that scrutinized their conditions or depicted them accurately. For most of these books contain only old reports about the conditions of long-gone kings, extinct civilizations, and customs that have vanished along with their peoples. There is not much point in simply recounting them. The best statement is the truest one, and people resemble their own times more than they resemble their ancestors. He explains his method further. I have set to confirm what I know and to verify what I do not know by asking one person after another about the state of their homeland and what it contains in all of its regions. I would ask one man about his country and then ask another and yet another in order to arrive at the truth, recording only the information that their testimonies corroborated. As for the subjects upon which their statements conflicted or were confused, I set them aside. Then I would leave the man in question for a period of time in which he might forget what he had told me. Afterwards, I would ask him the same question again, and if he replied in the same way, I would record his statement. But if he committed an error, I would cast his words into the wind. All of this so that I might satisfy my thirst for accurate transmission and feel confident in my verification. For I belong to a family whose occupation is to be a gathering place for visiting delegations, the point of every departure and every arrival. Indeed, for the kings of Egypt and Syria, we continue to be their gate, which opens to every knocker, and their rain cloud, which bursts forth with generosity. We are the first to receive each of their visitors and the last to see them off. He belonged to a family of very, very high-ranking scribes. His father, his brothers were all, his father was a chief, katib al-sir, what's the word that we use in English? So like a chief secretary, a vizier, and his eldest brother inherited his father's position. And Ibn Fadlallah was a notoriously prickly person who he was the head of the chancery in Damascus for a time, but he was very difficult to work with and had a very, very strong personality, which will come through a little bit later. So let me just also draw attention to the book's title, Masalik al-Absar fi Mamalik al-Amsar, connecting it to what he says here, the roots of insight into the civilized realms. I think this idea of insight, Masalik al-Absar, is important because it's not just about insight, it's also about sight, of seeing things, verifying things through actual personal witness. It's very much part of his methodology. For Ibn Fadlallah, seeing is believing. How then does this attitude play out in practice? What does Al-Umari have to say, or Ibn Fadlallah have to say about antiquities? In the first volume of the text, he has a section on famous ruins, Al-Athar al-Mashhura. He addresses Palmyra, Baalbek, Jarash, Manazil Thamud, various locations in Yemen. Most of these receive a pretty cursory treatment. A few lines here or there. He says about Palmyra that it's a city between Iraq and Asham, contains some wondrous buildings, some large columns. Baalbek has columns, a wall made of massive stones. People say that it was built by Solomon. There's a kind of dutiful regurgitation of precisely the kinds of reports that he didn't like, just like reporting what people have said about a place in the past. When we come to, this can be distinguished from his treatment of, for example, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which gets several pages with very detailed architectural description. When we come to the pyramids, he addresses, also pretty briefly, why were they built? People have speculated greatly about this. There's the different theories, the celestial temples, were they tombs, were they storehouses? He kind of meditates a little bit on the subject. He deals with the myth of Al-Ma'mun and the contents of the pyramids, which Marina talked about yesterday. The legend that Ma'mun got to Egypt, broke open the pyramids, went inside and discovered a treasure of 1,000 gold dinars, which turned out to be the exact amount of money that it cost to break into the pyramids. And he was like, oh, these Egyptians, they knew we were coming. And they left just enough money to cover our expenses, but no more. And Ibn Fadlallah says, yeah, that's what people say. He says, that's what's on al-sinat, ala al-sinat an-nas. That's what is on the tongues of people. But nah, I don't think so. He says, I've consulted the sound histories and the trustworthy books. I've never located this report in them. So he's not having any of that, right? Unsentimental. He addresses the question of the size of the pyramids. This is quite interesting. He says, as for the size of the two pyramids we've discussed, which is to say their height and area, this is reported comprehensively in the sources. The principle of verification in this book precludes me from passing on a report only on the basis of imitation, بمجرد التقليد, since it would be possible for me to verify it as a result of my frequent visitation of the pyramids and my residence in nearby Cairo. However, at the time of my composition of this work, I was unable to visit the site to see and verify its size due to some prevailing circumstances. It's like, come on, like, you've been there. We believe you. There are so many reports about the size of the pyramids, and yet he refuses to give us the number because he hasn't actually been to see them. I think that's kind of remarkable and gives you a sense of his method, which is that if there is a possibility of verification, what he calls imkan al-tahqiq, then you cannot simply report stuff that you haven't verified yourself. If you can verify it, then don't just give us the antiquarian, just don't give us this like literary empirical approach that you find in so many other encyclopedic texts. Okay. Interestingly, however, even Ibn Fadlallah could not help but be seduced by the kind of antiquarian sentimentality that we encountered in Nuwairi. My final example brings us to a lengthy section on ancient monasteries in his encyclopedia, a section which is 5 times longer than his treatment of famous ruins like the pyramids, Palmyra, etc. One of the reasons it's longer is because monasteries, perhaps counterintuitively to us today, were sites of erotic fascination and pleasure-seeking in much medieval Arabic poetry. There's a genre of these works, kutub al-diyarat, most of which are lost to us, but preserved in compilations like Ibn Fadlallah's. So the typical entry on a monastery would say, would describe what it looked like, its architecture, its bucolic environs, what was said about it by earlier authorities, usually accompanied by poems that mention the monastery by name. Included in the list of monasteries surveyed by Ibn Fadlallah was Deir Fiq, a monastery on the road from Damascus to the Golan. It was famously visited by Abu Nuwas, the great 8th century poet, notorious for his licentious verse, who took the occasion to compose a poem about a Christian boy he met there and lusted after. The poem is addressed to the boy, and it begins with a series of oaths. By the baptism in the old monastery, by its metropolitan and patriarch, by the pilgrimage to Masar Jusana, by the monasteries of Nawbahar and Fiq, by the silver crosses when they appear, and by the girdle around a slim waist, and by all the beauty that composes you. Have mercy on my helplessness, my parched lips. Now, as I draw close to you after our separation, I swear the oath of a man in love with his killer. You are the adornment of every monastery, and a feast, in spite of your harshness and recalcitrance. All your lovers announce that they are renouncing Islam and will go over to the Christians. So Ibn Fadlallah gives us this poem in his discussion of Deir Fiq. He doesn't give us the final line. That is not in his transmission. But he gives us the rest of it. A few pages later, Ibn Fadlallah devotes a brief discussion to Deir Baludhan, a monastery in a town near present-day Zabadani, near the Lebanon-Syria border, a place that he himself visited. He says of it, a magnificent ancient building with ample crops, vineyards, and fruit trees, and running fresh water. Found in the village of Baludhan, it's found in the village of Baludhan, which exists today in the region of Damascus. It is home to virtuous monks and graceful young Christian lads. Passing by the monastery once, I went down to take a closer look when I spied a young fellow, more beautiful than a gazelle, more brilliant indeed than the full moon. He had a slim waist, smoldering eyes, and a girdle cinched around his waist. framing his rump. He bewitched me with every flashing glance. Of him I wrote, "How lovely is the monastery of Baludan! What a monastery! And what Christians!" Those smoldering-eyed ones, unsurpassed in beauty, yet bashful as virgins. There I spied a lad who, no sooner than he appeared, seemed to vanish like the waning crescent moon. His frame swayed gently in an inebriated swoon as I caught his flushed glance. That slender waist has loosened the knot of my composure, even as it is cinched tight by its girdle. Part of what's interesting here is that Ibn Fadlallah, and this is an image from the manuscript, not from the section, but of a grapevine, is that Ibn Fadlallah does not merely relate an account of his trip to the monastery in his cold and calculating and verificationist manner. He relates it partly in order to give us the scene of him encountering the Christian boy, which is the occasion of the poetry. I'd like to gesture here to a great question asked yesterday by Ahmed Shamsi about how we understand the status of sites like Palmyra in the context of destruction. Ahmed suggested that the reason that ISIS and the Taliban are so exercised about the sites they destroy is because they think of them in religious terms and as sources of temptation to Muslims. They represent a kind of eternal present of idolatry, is how I think he put it. An eternal present that tempts the Muslim and seduces them away from true belief. Now, this obviously isn't how archaeologists and liberal humanists relate to these sites. However, for both groups, ISIS on the one hand and liberal humanists on the other, the sites possess an aura. And yet the animating power of that aura is very different. For most of us here, the aura of antiquities emanates from an idea of universal cultural heritage, a somewhat abstract, one might say, intellectual vision. For ISIS, the aura emanates from a more visceral dimension. These sites are sources of temptation, possessing real emotional power. They are objects of desire. Sinful, idolatrous, misplaced desire, in their view, but desire nonetheless. Perhaps we might even say that the sites are more alive, more present to them than they are to many of us. Something about the language of Ahmed's point, I feel, is very useful for examining both of these monastery scenes. In these scenes, the eternal present is the erotic reaction to a Christian boy, a reaction experienced both by Abu Nuwas and by Ibn Fadlallah. Monasteries exuded a sort of emotional power not unlike that of Palmyra for ISIS, creating a context that tempts the viewer, even tempts him to convert in the case of Abu Nuwas. But this is not a sinister vision for the medieval poets as it is for modern fundamentalists. To conclude, it seems clear that these authors are accessing the world around them through a layer of previous antiquarian engagements. For Nuwairi, it's impossible to talk about figs without thinking of Ibn Wahshiya's magical economical recipes and Ibn Khafaj's image of the breasts of Abyssinian girls. It's impossible to talk about a hippo without thinking of Aristotle's formulation via Jahiz. For Ibn Fadlallah, it's impossible to think about or indeed to visit a monastery without referencing the tradition of writing erotic poetry about Christian boys. Just as Nuwairi can't unhear Aristotle, Ibn Fadlallah can't unhear Abu Nuwas. Now, did he actually see the boy, or was that an antiquarian conceit? Did he actually feel desire, or was that merely an antiquarian conceit? Perhaps it's both. It's such a powerful layer of mediation that it affects even a staunch verificationist like him. It influences his encounter, his gaze, perhaps even his desire. In an antique Syrian monastery, the schematic and the mimetic, the past and the eternal present come together into an organic whole, art imitating life, imitating art. Thank you.